Are you doing intermittent fasting wrong? Here's what the research shows. So I am a fan of intermittent fasting. I don't want you to think that I'm not. I just don't love the approach of intermittent fasting blindly. Fasting glucose can be really deceiving. It's not a great marker. What I want to see is fasting insulin levels and A1C. That's going to tell me a 12-week glucose average. So what we know about intermittent fasting is it can be really useful in people who are insulin resistant, in people who are pre-diabetic. Now, I recommend you start with shorter fasting periods of about 12 hours and then you increase by 2 hours. Now, going past 16 hours, I'm not a fan of unless you're being monitored. So I recommend then a continuous glucose monitor so that we know exactly what's happening to your blood sugar. Because one thing that can happen with fasting, if it's not good for you, is it can affect your cortisol levels. Cortisol and insulin are inversely proportional. So if you have high cortisol or if you have low insulin, you might not be a great person for intermittent fasting. So we can catch these things when we do the proper blood work. There are other hormonal demographics that might not do well with intermittent fasting. One thing we know is that postmenopausal females may not do well with intermittent fasting. Now again, if you have high insulin, if you're overweight, that might be fine. However, if you are small framed and you have low hormone levels due to menopause, you might not be the best candidate for that. So another demographic that might not do great with intermittent fasting is people with PCOS syndrome, because you already have a tendency towards what's called androgen dominance. Now, if you're PCOS because you have high insulin, you might do fine. I would just like that you're monitored. But if you're PCOS, androgen dominant, and you don't have high insulin, fasting can actually help your body make more androgens, which is not what you want when you're already androgen dominant. So how do you know if you're androgen dominant? You might have cystic acne, you might have irregular cycles, you might have hair loss, you're not ovulating properly, and you have issues with fertility. Now, if you're a thin woman with low insulin, I wouldn't recommend fasting. If you're an overweight woman with high insulin levels, you might benefit from it. So what I'm saying with fasting is it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. Anybody can safely do 12 and 12. 12 hours of eating, 12 hours of fasting. Where I see a lot of people mess up with fasting is they're eating into late hours of the night because they're pushing their fasting period later into the day. Studies do show that if you start eating earlier and end eating earlier, it is more beneficial than starting later and eating later. So just be aware of that little tidbit. I don't care when you break fast, I care what you break fast with. So it's called breakfast because it's what you break fast with. And the most important thing to break fast with is gonna be a protein, or a protein with a healthy fat, or a protein with a healthy fat and even fiber. What I don't want you breaking fast with is straight carbohydrates. A bowl of cereal, a waffle with syrup, a donut. Doing intermittent fasting to break your fast with that doesn't make any sense to me. I am all about stable blood sugar. I've been preaching that for 20 years teaching nutrition. Be careful with intermittent fasting. I believe it can benefit many people, and we should take breaks from eating. It is good for us. You can do fasting in different ways and fast one day per month. You could fast one day per week. People have done longer periods of fasting, as long as 3 to 5 days. And again, I'm not opposed. You have to know why you're doing it, what your metabolic markers are going into it. And I believe if you're doing periods that long, you need to be working with a practitioner by your side, or be using some type of tracking device like a continuous glucose monitor. Because the interesting thing is I'll see people not eat and they'll have spikes in glucose, and then you'll see people eat and their glucose is actually more stable. Our glucose levels aren't all created equally because it's based on what our cortisol level is going into it and what our insulin level is going into it. So cortisol is impacted by a lot of things. Cortisol can be impacted by your blood sugar. Cortisol is impacted by your stress levels, and cortisol can even be impacted by pain levels. All these things that mess with cortisol can also mess with insulin and blood sugar. So if you're struggling with fasting, if you're struggling with your hormones, just reach out to us at the Wellness Connection. Our functional medicine team is very educated on different fasting methods, and we can help connect you to the right testing and to the right type of dietary protocols that are specific to your hormonal and your metabolic needs. A one-size-fits-all approach does not work for everybody, and if you feel like it's not working for you, we'd be more than happy to work with you. The link is in the description. You don't have to be in person. We work with many people virtually.